Hey folks, welcome back. This is Andy with the Poor Pro's Almanac. Today we've got a very unique episode. We're joined by Ben Brownlow from Fox Holler Almanac to discuss scything in a modern context, and unlike previous interview episodes, we're actually going to be pairing this with a really lengthy 101 Substack article which we collaborated to put together. So when you're listening, if you find yourself really interested in learning more, or maybe you find yourself drawn to the way Ben explains scything, check out our Substack article on poorprolsalmanac.substack.com. You can also get there by going to poorprols.com and going to the supplemental reader section. It's broken out into two parts, so you can read one part, listen to the interview, read the second part. We go from broad strokes conversation to more in-depth detail along from part 1 to part 2. So it's a good length of reading, and it should definitely help answer a lot of questions. There's some video content integrated into the Substack article with some how-tos, some examples of what he's talking about. So it's a really great multimedia resource for somebody that's getting into scything for the first time. So I really hope you guys enjoy this interview. Go check out Ben's work on the links listed in the show notes, and tell us what you think. Ben, thanks so much for coming on. First, tell us a little bit about yourself, your farm, and your work.
Okay, yeah. So I've been sort of doing a variety of things here on a community land trust for about 11 years, sort of an integration of tree crops, native habitat, and pastured livestock. So we have an agroforestry cooperative and a dairy cooperative that's kind of under the umbrella of a lot of my work. And we do some pastured pork and pastured poultry alongside that, some subsistence gardening and plant breeding. We've been working on breeding perennial walking onions to have bigger bulbs, breeding squash and cowpeas. We're here in Northeast Missouri, so those crops seem to do pretty well for us. The land trust is 280 acres. About 100 of those acres is in the Conservation Reserve Program in native warm season grasses mostly. We've got some woodlands, we have some sites for human development, and we have some agriculture sites that are separate from either that reserve space or that forested space. Also, I help to feed a kitchen collective, and that's where a lot of the produce ends up going to. And so we have 12 adults and 3 kids, kind of in an outdoor kitchen during the months when that is possible.
Awesome. Now, for that trust, were you involved in the development of it, or was this something you kind of walked into?
No, it's it was a really great thing to not have to figure that out.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. I think what you're doing is what a lot of people listening probably would love to do. So I guess before we even get into the scything content, I do want to pick a little bit at this because I know people probably want to hear about it. Tell me a little bit about, like, you've got this land trust and you've got all these kind of peripheral organizations going on with it. What does that look like in the day-to-day, like structurally, not like what you're doing, but like how does that actually function and like exist?
Yeah. It's very complicated, but it seems to work. It's been working for about 25 years now. There is it's a 501c3 nonprofit that is sort of related to the community land trust. It's essentially functions as a board to oversee land use. And so, of the 280 acres here in Northeast Missouri, the majority of it has been put aside for habitat restoration of native tallgrass prairie. But we do have about 40 acres cut out of that for human development. And so, to be able to lease that space, a person becomes a member of the nonprofit, agrees to a handful of sort of covenants. It can almost be looked at as like a homeowners association, except our rules make a little bit more sense. So we're committed to sharing resources, organic production, habitat restoration, radical recycling of resources, and that type of thing. Those are sort of written into your lease. So we have a land trust board that's composed of people who live here. We have a nonprofit board that's kind of a combination of people who live here and a few folks outside of the community that sort of helps steer that. And then the actual among us who are here on the land are ourselves. We have a variety of organizations. different committees to handle anything from firewood acquisition onto conflict resolution onto what types of agricultural policies do we want to set up for folks coming in. And so it is sort of a series of overlapping groups of people, and we do operate under consensus.
So you're basically living the dream, is what you're saying.
Oh, it's such a sometimes it's a nightmare. It is a lot of work. It's just sort of ending up. I would say that my goals coming into this project had a lot more to do with my relationship to land and a lot more to do with how I wanted to relate to resources in the world and how I wanted to respond to all the sort of doom out there. And I sort of found that resource sharing and communal living and shared decision making are tools in the toolkit to deal with that. I didn't necessarily come here because I really wanted to live with other people. I found that a necessary practice if we want to actually address some of these larger issues that we have. So, as like an individual homesteader or homesteading family, maybe we could reduce our impact, on the earth a little bit. But without that sort of cooperative step in the right direction, the reduction of impact is kind of minimal compared to the model that we're trying to build. And so in a large part, we're trying to build a model that can be, learned from, replicated to a certain degree. I also want to mention that in terms of land use, we sort of cluster a lot of the housing and shared resources together in one sort of centralized area so that we can have larger tracts of land for wildlife and habitat restoration that don't have as much human impact on them. Now, there is a level of human impact in that we will burn our prairies sometimes to maintain healthy vegetation, and we will go out and manage our woodlands a little bit, and we do occasionally do some grazing and haying in those conservation areas in drought type emergencies as we've had this year.
Yeah, I bet. It's been a wild year, that's for sure. So they've been burning that prairie for a number of years, then I'm guessing. Like, are you guys on like a 3 or a 5 year cycle, something like that?
Roughly a 3 to 5 year cycle for most of our areas. And once it, what we're stepping that up a little bit to control Lespedeza. We've had an issue with Lespedeza here on the land. Our local NRCS office says the only way to deal with it is to spray it down. But of course, we have an ecological covenant for organic practices. We're attempting to burn that a little bit more frequently to get that Lespedeza under control. That sort of, you can't really do it every year because you won't develop enough thatch. There's not enough fuel in the field to burn, but every other year we might be able to pull off depending on how quickly that thatch develops.
Yeah, I would be really interested to see how effective that is over the long term because I would imagine that it would, given the way, historically speaking, the way fire has interacted with non-natives here in North America, that it seems to be really effective. So I definitely would like to know in a couple of years how that's working out for you.
I'm
Uh,
hoping well.
yeah. Now, this interview is a little bit different than what I've done in the past for listeners. We're doing something really fun. We're actually pairing this with a pair of Substack articles, part 1 and 2, that we collaborated on, which you put a lot of the technical data into, which outlines a lot of the information on scything for folks that are new to the process, or maybe they've read or tried a couple times and they've never really had any success, or they did it once and they're like, my back hurts, I'm never doing that again, even though I want to do it. And I'm one of those people. I have hurt my back. I hurt my back doing a lot of things. This is just one of them. So I get it. And I think it's really important to have an accessible resource that is not hierarchical in the way the content is delivered, the information is delivered, that it's we're all learning this together. And some of us are in different spots in that learning journey. And I don't think when you start going down these really esoteric, like, knowledge sources, you can end up in some really kind of culty spaces. So I think this is really important to like kind of offer this as an alternative. So first off, thank you for being involved and having such significant input in this. To get to the actual content, what got you into scything and I guess thinking about this need to have less of an impact and less of a negative impact on the landscape in general?
Yeah, well, so I would say that sort of my experience kind of growing up in a punk DIY space sort of prepared me for this between dumpster diving, booking my own shows, fixing bicycles. I started examining resources in a different way.
That's like the Boy Scout badges for punk kids. It's
Right.
like,
Yeah.
have you? Which of these have you done yet, and which ones do you still need to do?
Yeah. Yeah. And so I sort of found that with gentle guidance and support from others that like I could teach myself skills. And as I sort of got a little bit more interested in ecology and subsistence agriculture and aware of some doom in the world, found myself here in community, and I had a neighbor who kind of brought me into the fold for scything. He Chad Knepp, he's no longer with us, but he often used to say, "I'm in one of the top five, scythe mowers in North America," and I think I believe that. Um, but despite all that expertise, he was always open to just sharing use of the tool and trying to get more people excited about it because it was something that he was certainly really excited about. And so, about 10 years back, he held just sort of a little workshop. Come on out, bring a scythe, if you got one, and I'm going to teach you a few things. I showed up with kind of a crappy old garage sale scythe, and he said, "No, no, no, that's not going to do." But took a lot of time to help me make my own handle there that day and showed me some of the basics. And so one of the things that I recognize I'm really privileged about living in community is that I have a lot of live resources of people who have done this stuff. Like whether or not you want it, sometimes if you're attempting a new skill here, you get an opinion on that. And I was very lucky to have a handful of people around me that already sort of have this tool and knew how to use it. Chad really taught himself, just kind of, I think he spent a lot of time with some archaic texts because he was learning this. This is pre YouTube, a lot of
Yeah,
this
right.
skill building. And so, like, I don't think that there is a really solid replacement for a mentor mentee type relationship with a tool where a lot of the knowledge is sort of lost. But this document that I'm working on is sort of an attempt to give folks the basics. I've sort of found that, yeah, as you said, there's some higher level esoteric inaccessible info out there, and there's sort of a and maybe sort of a hint of gatekeeping around that information. And then there is sort of the very brief introduction provided by folks that I'm not sure if they're actually using the tool or if they're like, "Hey, this thing looks badass and it's going to get me some clicks." Uh, so I'm trying to find the middle ground of giving folks some actual useful information and some direction, kind of going to the right place. I think it is something that you can teach yourself, and that takes time and it takes patience, and certainly don't want to lead anyone down the road of getting their back hurt in that process.
One of the things I've noticed on social media is people talking about like AI being used to write books. And a friend of mine pointed me to the fact that a lot of foraging books are being written almost verbatim the same by
Hmm,
different authors all around the same time. And he's like, I think this is AI, and I think they're trying to sell stuff. And like foraging is not something you can kind of AI automate, right?
right.
Like slight differences, and suddenly you're suggesting something that's poisonous is edible. You know what I mean? Like there's some dangers there. I'll be really curious to see how like a lot of this esoteric kind of content gets picked up by AI as, hey, this is an underserved market. Let's like go through this compendium of information that exists from like ripping through or reading through like old texts that are PDF uploaded to some storage facility or whatever the fuck. And they just kind of like translate it into some like half-assed meaningless textbook that's a 101 on like any of this kind of stuff. And that's really frightening. I feel like you're starting to go down this weird road of like you have to know your author. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
The way you might need to like, I don't know, I guess there's no like example of like when you would need to know the person behind something. So it's like this really kind of scary idea that like like people have historically written books that they didn't actually know. And foraging is like a really good example of that. Like there are a lot of scientists and researchers or journalists that'll just be like, I'm going to go through other books and pull that information to make my own book, and have never actually worked with the plant. And a lot of that information is maybe anecdotal or maybe not nuanced as it should be. And that's where you get into like a lot of trouble. And I could see that happening in scything as well, because again, it's kind of like, who's going to fact check this because no one else knows it. So you put out your book and it like helps your image of being like the homesteader guy. And, you know, maybe it's a follow up to your first book that did pretty well. And you're like, writing is a lot easier than farming. So like, let me just keep pumping out books on shit I don't know about. Hey, this is Andy from the Poor Proles Almanac letting you know about our Bur Oak Acorn Competition. We're looking for the biggest, most tannin-free acorns you got, with a small prize attached to both the biggest, the most tannin-free, and the best combined, with naming rights as we propagate those selections to boot. For more information, visit poorproles.com and click on the Bur Oak Competition bar. So with that diatribe in place, you did this mentor-mentee type relationship. Like, what did it look like to start thinking about trying to integrate scything into like actually managing a landscape?
Yeah, that's a really great question. For me, I think that when I sort of gained some proficiency with the tool and my body was younger, I had this temptation to look at an acre field and say to myself, you know what? The traditional measure of acre was how much a person could scythe in a day, and I'm going to try that out. And usually find myself breaking down after about a half acre or so. And I kind of see it as a tool in the toolkit. We don't exclusively function with just scythes here. We do take out a brush hog now and then. We will mow things with machines. You know, we have a lot of land that we're managing, but it's sort of like finding out where there's bottlenecks with those machines and seeing, testing out if the scythe is more appropriate in those spaces. I would say that a way to think of it, maybe there's a couple ways to think of it. It's like a scythe may not be as efficient as a lawnmower or a tractor time wise, but a scythe can be used efficiently. You've got this kind of there's maybe a couple gradients. One would be efficiency versus resiliency of the tool. And so like on the efficient side of the scale, we can use a different example, vegetable seed. Okay. Hybrid vegetables. If you plant some hybrid tomatoes, you know they're going to make lots and lots of big tomatoes all at once when you want them under ideal conditions. That's a very efficient way to grow that crop. You know, you start planting some of these heirloom seeds, and you'll notice that some of them do really well in a dry year. Some of them do better, resist cracking or something in a wet year. It may not get you to those high numbers under like perfect conditions, but in adverse conditions, they may do better than the hybrids. I sort of, in a way, view the scythe as a tool that's more resilient than it is efficient. It works great in wet grasses. It works great in little spots. And another thing is it puts our feet on the ground a little bit more. It's a contemplative sort of activity. It sort of brings you into your surroundings a little bit more. If you think about getting into the cab of a tractor and going out, like we'll go out and we've got some of these patches of Lespedeza are getting pretty big, and we'll try to mow them down before they go to seed. And yeah, you can cover a lot of ground in it, but the little individual plants that are out there in the middle of the sward, they're driving all the way, driving a quarter mile away to hit 6 or 7 plants in the middle of a field starts to make a little bit less sense. But if you're walking out there, you start seeing all the little plants. It kind of brings us a little bit closer in. It's a relationship building tool between a human and a landscape. There's a sort of an energy, an establishment energy versus a maintenance energy sort of gradient to look at in terms of what tools we use to manage land as well. It may not be really easy to dig a pond with a shovel by yourself. That's something where you might want to use a fossil fuel machine to push that pond into place. In the long run, we're kind of getting some benefits that are going to close some of our resource loops by having that pond on site. And so, there are some factors there that you weigh. I'm going to put in energy ahead of time so that I can use less energy overall. I'm going to require resources for an infrastructure project, and then I won't require those resources much longer as a result of what I've built. The scythe is a tool that doesn't require a lot of maintenance energy. We're not fueling it up every time we need to use it, other than eating breakfast or whatever. And so, whereas a lawnmower or a weed whacker or any of those things, we got to put fuel into it every time we use it. And so, for a large space, no, a scythe doesn't necessarily make sense all the time, unless you've got the sort of communal infrastructure of a bunch of people that want to mow with you. We have done that. That is fun. But I think that where the scythe makes a little bit more sense is, let's say you're wanting to manage some grass by grazing. You can use a scythe to cut down the outline for the electronet fencing that you're going to set up so it doesn't short out, so you can keep the animals in where they're supposed to be. And the animals can manage that grass for you, and then you can move it again. And so you've kind of taken a couple of acres and reduce the amount that you have to mow to a half an hour in the morning, something like that. I don't know. Is that getting at what you're asking?
Yeah, yeah. I think again to the point that we started with, it's like scything has like this really interesting cultural relic status that people are drawn to. That's why people want to like talk about them or pretend to write books about how they use them. But trying to find the balance of where it's appropriate versus, well, we have all this equipment. Why would I want, the goal isn't to go backwards. So why would I use this? When it's like, well, actually, I think instead of thinking of it as a replacement for like a lawnmower, it probably is a better replacement for like a weed whacker.
That's right. Yeah.
When you start thinking about the dangers of weed whacking, if you have young trees, it's very easy to destroy a young tree by not realizing how long the string is. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't take much to fully understand the risks and damages that can happen when you're using something that is so mechanized and so quick versus the slow and thoughtful process of a scythe, where you can be very careful and slow where you need to be in a way that mechanical equipment sometimes just doesn't have that nuance. And I think when we're talking about nuanced landscapes or landscape management, that nuance is really kind of the devil in the details, right? Where that's where you get into trouble the most, is when you don't pay attention to those areas that need extra attention. I know we had talked before recording, as we were working on the Substack piece, about like, oh, hey, I found this really rare plant that I would have never seen if I was just blasting through here. So I cut around it so it would go to seed, and that way there's more of it. And, this is great for the local ecology, but I would have never caught that if I was, just flying through with some equipment. And that's where, that slowness, that taking the time, it really pays like significant dividends for the ecosystem health.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, just in terms of animal life, when I'm out with a scythe all the time, I'm finding snake nests, I'm finding ground nesting birds. I can usually get up to a point where I say, "Oh, there's something already here," and I can just ignore a spot. A lot of times on a tractor, that might be
Yeah.
a little bit too late. There's actually, the sound of machines can kind of take us out of the space a lot of the time, and so we're able to sort of enter that observation and an interaction place a little bit more carefully.
Yeah, so as somebody who, like I said, I hurt my back the first time I tried to use a scythe, got angry, hung it up for like a year, broke it back out, hurt my back again, and I was like, you know what? I need to like actually learn how to do this instead of being like, how hard can it be? I see videos of people just like swinging this thing back and forth in the grass and it cuts, and mine isn't. So let me figure out what's going on here. And I think a lot of that plays down to the piece of equipment that you're using, the scythe itself, the size of the piece of equipment. Because again, like you, a lot of people coming into this are just like, huh, I saw one at a yard sale once. It was hanging on a barn and they didn't want it. So I got it for 25 bucks. And like with no context of, is this actually even supposed to be for grass, and I think that is where you get tripped up, is trying to save money, trying to just half-assed your way into this practice. So I don't know if you could talk a little bit about like what that process looks like, getting into the equipment.
Yeah, totally. And this is a place where it's like my sort of DIY values of we can build anything, we can make anything work, sort of clash with it does help to start off with something that's kind of nice. The sort of, especially in North America, what you're going to come across at a flea market or a yard sale is going to be an Anglo-American type scythe. And this is sort of it's got sort of a big, bendy, heavy wooden, sometimes metallic handle, and it's going to have a big stamped blade that's got a lot of weight on it. And I've played around with them a little bit. I know that they were developed for a purpose, and I have not figured out what that purpose is. I really recommend starting off with, they'll call it a continental or a European or an Austrian type blade. These are still being manufactured. They're available new, and that's sort of like going to be the piece of equipment, starting with the blade, a nice thin blade, not too thin when you're first starting out, because you can break it real quick. But having an Austrian style blade and a snath, that's the handle that fits your body, is key. But this isn't a tool. You don't need to have. You don't. It's not a tool of strength. It's really about technique and maintaining a sharp edge. And it's almost kind of a Tai Chi like in your approach. So yeah, in terms of the equipment, there's a handful of different blade styles. Sort of on the end that nobody really needs would be a hay blade or a field blade. These things are incredibly long, incredibly fragile. I think they're kind of for showboating anymore, unless you're like in the places where people are still using scythes to put up hay. And that is happening globally. But a grass blade, if you've got sort of lighter grasses and not a lot of obstructions out in the areas where you're going to be mowing, if you're kind of going for a more kempt lawn, you might be able to achieve that more with the grass blades. There's a ditch blade, which is sort of in between a grass blade and a bush blade. Those bush blades are pretty thick. They're really sturdy. You can cut through saplings. You can, knock out brambles. Some of the thicker stalked weeds, in fact, wouldn't be appropriate. Doing a lot of ragweed that's mature, or pokeweed, or any of that stuff with a grass blade could damage the blade. So moving to a ditch blade or a bush blade might be more appropriate in that sort of rougher terrain. And yeah, having something that fits your body. So there's a few scything gear outfits that I could recommend. One of them, you're going to pay for it, but you can get a custom snath made for your body. You have to take some measurements. It's sort of a fun date for you and a friend to kind of figure that out, and you can send them in. That's a Scythe Supply, and they're out in Perry, Maine. You can send them your body geometry. They're really great for having clear instructions on their website, and they'll send you a snath that fits the blade and fits you. Otherwise, there are adjustable snaths out there that are available. The brand that sort of makes some of the better blades and also makes pretty good quality adjustable snaths is called Fux, Fux. Uh,
It fucks.
Fux, yeah. Feels good to say it, doesn't it? But they do, they have some that are semi-adjustable for different sizes of person. In general, though, if you want to make your own, of course, I'm a booster of making your own. Once you sort of learn how they're put together, you want to have that handle interact with the blade in such a way that if you're standing right next to it and standing with the blade in front of your face, the edge of the blade at the bottom just comes up to your chin. That's a really good basic way to look at that. In the document, I go through a lot of the sort of postures, and we have some illustrations to sort of demonstrate, the way you carry your body in it. But, in general, like if you don't want to burn yourself out, if you start feeling like you're mowing with a lot of force versus just sort of loosening up and going, if you're hitting that grass hard, you're having to really push the blade through, it may be time to sharpen. And so we try to keep these objects sharp objects. Typically, we'll have a whetstone in the field that you can kind of hone the edge. And I typically hone my edge about 1 minute out of every 10 minutes of mowing. It seems like a lot, but it's an opportunity to catch your breath and think about your life. I think sometimes that's pretty important.
Yeah.
Once in a while, we gotta hammer these blades too.
One of the things I want to bring up though that you've just kind of alluded to is that it's a process that is very slow and methodical, and that can be counterintuitive in the modern world of taking your time, taking frequent breaks, working slowly and thoughtfully. That's just not how we do anything, at least in this country. Everything is about speed and efficiency and trying to do things in a way that reduces your downtime or maybe even like collectivizes your downtime into like one big chunk. You know, it's your lunch break, not three different breaks throughout the day or four different breaks throughout the day. And that can be really difficult for somebody new who's like, I want to do this thing and I don't want to take a break every couple minutes. I want to go and be good at it and like clear this field. And it's like, well, no, you part of that is engaging with the physicality of it, with the process of it, and like it's almost like an iterative process where you can read how you're doing with the landscape by how the blade is reacting and you respond accordingly. And that is really difficult to do because we have, like I said, we haven't spent any of our lives really doing that. Everything we do kind of just goes out into the void, and that's about it. There's no like feedback, and that can be really difficult to like engage with in a way that like doesn't feel frustrating.
Yeah, I think it might take a little bit of deconditioning or something. I don't know if that's the right word. Now we're talking about scythe cult stuff, but I
Yeah,
do.
that's how it happens.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and another thing is so the amount of time in a day when it's actually effective to scythe is pretty limited. It gets too hot, the grasses get too dry. I think I mentioned this before that compared to like a lot of mechanical equipment, grass cuts better with a scythe when it's got dew on it or it's wet. The blades are just plumper and they're pierced more easily by the edge. And so, we have there's limitations. To use this tool is to purposefully set limitations on yourself, and it offers a lot of space for reflection on it. So, like if we were in sort of a non-capitalistic way going through our land management practices in a more not only seasonal but hour to hour sort of experience, like, okay, we set aside an hour or so early in the morning for scything, and then we take care of something else, and we come back to that scything the next day. It is this sort of graduated process, and it's going to in the long run give us a lot more understanding, of the land we're stewarding. It might lead to some efficiencies in the future. I sort of said, when I first started off, I thought, I'm going to just kind of mow everything, this is so fun. And now I keep my mowing pretty minimal to what needs to be mown, and it's taken me the better part of a decade to figure out what does and doesn't actually need that treatment. In what other ways can I steward land by either leaving it alone or incorporating a different management that the scythe is only helping me incorporate, and that type of thing. But it does put you in a different rhythm for sure. Though there are times when it's just like, I gotta bust ass and get this paddock moved. There's actually a fair bit of that, but I'm
No.
hoping to sort of ease off on some of the animal agriculture that we're doing here. That was also sort of maybe more of an infrastructure type use of energy. And now that we've gotten some of the results we wanted with animal production, moving more towards tree crops. And you want to talk about sort of a glacial scale of affecting an ecosystem positively, get those hickories in.
True crops are it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think now, looking back at 10 years, if you never got into the scythe, that you'd have the same fluency and understanding of the ecosystem around you?
I that's a really good question. I think it's certainly aided me in that. I think there's other ways that I could find to interact with our local ecosystem, sure, but this has been being sort of a daily practice. I sort of get a very deep, consistent look at it. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I think a person could. I don't think I could. I think that this has been a really invaluable tool for me. I sometimes have a little bit more energy that I need. And it's been a really great way to sort of channel that into observation instead of doing. I think I'd be fixing a lot of problems that I created with machines.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's really, we pick up these habits and sometimes it's very easy to forget how much we learn from those habits. You go out in the field and you see a plant that you maybe never noticed before because it's really small, be a tiny little flower or something. You're like, huh, I would have never seen that if I was just blowing through here with a lawnmower or a tractor or whatever. And then you start to understand, oh, this plant has like all these ecosystem services, and you start to notice the how it relates to the ecosystem around you, the flies or bees, pollinators that might be attracted to it.
Hmm.
And there's this whole like butterfly effect of like, if I hadn't seen that one little flower, I would have never noticed all these other things, right?
Right.
And that can be really important. It's like just that idea of slowing everything down a little bit to just take a moment and engage with the environment as it is in that specific moment that I don't think we do a lot of. We're so quick to, you look at like the permaculture thing and it's like a lot of it is I found a site, okay, let's do a topographic map of this site, figure out the way the water is flowing down it, how do we catch most of it? And it's like, well, all right, let's see what the system looks like for a year or two. Even that first year can be very much well, that was an abnormally dry or wet year. You didn't get to see the other side of things. And just taking that slowness, I don't think we have enough respect for in this like conquest of making up for generations of being disconnected from ecosystems and their natural progression with and without humans. A lot of people desperately are trying to solve that problem of that relationship without actually being thoughtful about it and slow about it. And I think something like slow tools like the scythe can be really important in really helping us learn to slow our brains down a little bit. And that's where I think it's more valuable than anything because it does force us to relate with the landscape in a different way and have a little bit more respect for it and its scale, right? And the size of it in a way that technology can sometimes make it really easy to lose sight of. I'm managing 7 acres of land where I am, for example. And it's like it's very easy to forget how big 7 acres is when you can ride on a tractor through it. You
Hmm.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the scythe really puts that into perspective a lot better, and like how diverse 7 acres can be, and how much nuance and how many different you know ecotypes can exist in such a little space. And that's where I find a lot of that beauty really exists with these types of tools.
There's also this sort of observation over time that occurs where we can see our impact years down the road if we're out in that field every day. Let's say I've noticed my goats just don't eat goldenrod. Nobody eats goldenrod. The cows don't eat goldenrod. The pigs don't eat goldenrod. And if they're out in the pasture eating everything but goldenrod, I get a lot of goldenrod. If I go out and mow down that goldenrod before it goes to seed, I get less goldenrod. I want to be somewhere in between, maybe. I can use
Yeah.
that scythe to just I can react and respond to plant populations, or learn to not react or respond to plant populations depending on what the goals are. And so it's really interesting to see where stands of bergamot or goldenrod or ironweed or milkweed
Yeah.
develop or drop, and this happens over a period of years.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of a sort of observation in detail and over time.
This is something I've noticed too, more frequently the last year or two is like this landscape where I am was just, it didn't have a lot of understory growth because the canopy was so dense. I cleared some of the canopy. It's still a work in progress, like everything. And now that there's grasses and forbs coming up and my sheep are working through it, it's becoming more and more obvious what they don't eat and the really, you start thinking about systems thinking, right? You've got livestock that you've got on the landscape. I've noticed here with my sheep that they don't really like native forbs the way they like native grasses, and they'll go after most European stuff that shows up here. And like you think about it from like a bigger scale, and that makes a lot of sense given how they've evolved and the landscapes where they've evolved. And then you start to pay attention to the trees that they do enjoy, and it's like, all right, well, which trees have very similar counterparts in Europe?
Right.
And it's like, okay, you can start to see how these things really integrate together, and how we can use non-native livestock as a tool for better management, especially with invasives and non-natives and so on. And like just by having that time on the landscape and paying attention and moving slowly and thoughtfully, you start to notice, there's a lot of burnweed over here.
Mhm.
There's pokeweed over here. The pokeweed's taking off very quickly because nothing is dealing with it, basically. And just like that little bit of understanding of from taking the time to just be with the landscape as it is at different parts of the year, where those become more evident and you can make those management decisions about, hey, I'm happy there's pokeweed. I don't need a half acre of pokeweed. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And like kind of understanding from that relationship and that slowness through the landscape. I think that's where that context for utilizing slow tools like this is really valuable in a way that again, you can, yeah, someone that's been on the landscape for a long time is going to pick it up, but especially for someone new, it's really invaluable to kind of build that kind of relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. There's some agility to this thing too. I think that's really important, just in terms of we've made our observations. We don't need to apply a broad scale, quote unquote, efficient solution to the whole 7 acres or the whole 280 acres or to the small, little guerrilla planting that we have down in some woods somewhere. Like we can apply just a little bit of leverage. Just a little bit of leverage is what this tool might give us. And so
Yeah,
we can make our impact small and meaningful as opposed to widespread for a smaller issue that we're dealing with.
that's for sure. So, Ben, I've already plugged our Substack at the beginning of this. But for folks that want to see more of your writing, if you're on social media, any of those types of things, let's get those handles out there so people can go follow you around.
Yeah, yeah. My Substack, the address on that is benjaminbramble.substack.com. And I have sort of created that in Almanac format. So I'll kind of take on what is the issue of the season that I'm writing about this week, or usually every 10 days. I'm a pretty busy guy. And some of these things will be a little bit more technical. Some of those things will be a little bit more observational. Some of them are a little historical. And then also, if you want to check out our Instagram page, just for the sake of some pretty pictures, I only try to sell beef on it maybe once every few weeks. Um, but I try to keep it educational, and that is at Fox Holler Farmstead, all one word. Yeah, you can check out our land trust project, is Dancing Rabbit Eco Village. Also worth a look see there. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Ben, this has been really interesting. It was super fun trying to put this article together. I learned a ton from you, so I appreciate that. And I think if anyone's enjoyed this conversation, go check it out. Go follow you on Substack, and go get a scythe if you can, and go cut some grass, mow some hay.
Yeah, if you're in Northeast Missouri and you have a suitable tool and you're not sure how to use it, come on out here. We got plenty of work for you.
There you go. You even got free fields to work in. Uh, Ben, thanks so much. This has been a blast.
Yep, no problem.